Welcome to the Virulent Vortex, a podcast in which we discuss infectious diseases from pathogens, molecules to populations, pandemics, and everything in between. My name is Jaap de Rode. I'm a biology professor here at Emory University, and I'm joined today
Maria Garcia Quesada. Hi, I am a fourth-year PhD student here in the Department of Epidemiology, primarily focusing on vaccine research, specifically vaccines that prevent diarrheal disease.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And so I understand that you're interested in Shigella. So tell me what that is.
So Shigella is a bacteria that can cause diarrhea. It's most common in low resource settings, most dangerous for young children, particularly in areas, as I mentioned, low resource like sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And diarrhea is a leading cause of mortality among young kids. The most prevalent pathogen is rotavirus, for which we have a vaccine, but kind of behind it is Shigella, for which we currently do not have a vaccine.
So when a child has diarrhea, how easy is it to tell whether it's rotavirus or, in your case, Shigella?
It's very difficult, especially in these types of low-resource, high-burden settings. There's very high circulation of all sorts of pathogens that cause diarrhea, which there are many. And so it's frequent to have co-infections. It's frequent to have infections due to pathogens that are not actually causing diarrhea. And so when a kid comes in, a lot of times, we'll test them and they'll test positive for many pathogens, and then it's really hard to figure out which one is the cause of diarrhea versus which ones are causing what we call a subclinical infection that are just there hanging out. So fortunately, it has gotten a little bit easier since we've moved kind of from primarily testing using culture-based methods, that is basically binary, where we can just see, yes, there is or is not a pathogen, to now we have these molecular methods like PCR, where we can also identify pathogen quantity. And so then we can leverage that quantity of the pathogen to say the more pathogen there is, the more likely that is the pathogen causing diarrhea.
Okay. And so with culture-based, you mean you plate it on a plate and see if bacteria are growing, and then PCR would be based on their DNA to see if it's there. Okay. And so that's a challenge. And I'm assuming, based on what it is, you have different treatments, because antibiotics may work against Shigella, but doesn't work against rotavirus. So Okay. And so then you mentioned that rotavirus, there's a vaccine available. Shigella, there is not. But then your research is focused on vaccines. Is that right?
Yes. So fortunately, there are many Shigella vaccines in the pipeline. So kind of going through the trial phases. There's 3 major phases generally that vaccines go through before we decide whether to license them or not. And so right now we have several Shigella vaccines that are approaching these phase 3 trials that are the last ones, the big ones, where we can actually try to get an estimate of how disease incidence changes among the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated group.
And so these vaccines exist. They're now part of the trial. And is that the research you're doing, the particular trial, and figuring out if they work?
Almost. So they are approaching the phase 3 trials. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is how do we prepare for those trials? So obviously these are big trials, they're expensive trials, just very resource intensive in a lot of ways. And so we want to make sure that when the vaccine is ready to be put into those trials, that we know how to design them appropriately to basically give the vaccine the best shot that we can getting licensed ultimately.
I love how you say giving the vaccine the best shot.
Yeah, not intentional, but there it is.
And okay, so how do I envision that? Do you make computer models and so with some information on the vaccine and say, okay, so if I administered it, this is the number of people I need, this is when I give the vaccine. How does that work?
Yeah, so I'm doing 2 main projects to kind of get at 2 issues. So one is to design the trial, we need to know how much Shigella disease there is in a community or in a country. I'm working with this study that is based at the University of Washington, the Enterics for Global Health Shigella Surveillance Study. And so they are working in 7 different country sites to try to measure Shigella disease incidence. And they're doing so by using what they call this hybrid study design. And it's hybrid because they're using different components of data collection. One being capturing cases in healthcare facilities. So kids who get sick with diarrhea, they go to seek care. We test them to see whether they have Shigella or not. So we have number of people with Shigella. Then on the other hand, they're measuring, okay, how many people live in the catchment area for those facilities? So what is our denominator out of which we would get those cases going to seek care? But then the missing piece there is that, especially in these low resource settings, not everyone is seeking care for diarrhea. And so we're also, or not we, they are conducting these healthcare utilization surveys to try to get an idea of the characteristics of people who do and do not seek care, so we can make that adjustment as best as possible. So this is a very kind of traditional statistical analysis where I've been working on how we can optimize the methods to get, again, the best estimate that we can of what is the true incidence of Shigella diarrhea in these sites. So that's one of the things that I'm doing. The other is a little bit more like what you're saying, is doing a simulation study. And that simulation study is to address the issue that we talked about earlier of how do we know when it's truly a Shigella diarrhea case versus when it's rotavirus diarrhea case with a Shigella subclinical infection. And so for this, we are leveraging data from a previous longitudinal cohort study where we measured kind of pathogen quantities and diarrhea in kids over time, and then using that data to create the simulated cohort where, because we can never know the truth in reality of who's a true Shigella case or not, we simulate them. So we decide, we assign these pathogen quantities, and then from there we can kind of test different criteria for classifying cases to see which one kind of gets us closest to the true impact of the vaccine.
Yeah. Okay, and so with these two approaches combined, you're ready when the vaccine comes your way. So is it actually going to come your way? Are you going to be able to do this as part of your PhD studies?
Hopefully I'll be gone before then. But yes, the idea is that we'll kind of get these two pieces and they'll contribute to the design of the studies, because especially for the first part that I mentioned, the Enterics for Global Health study, these 7 sites where they're measuring incidence, the hope is that those will be the 7 sites where the trials will be conducted.
And so these are large trials. So how many people are going to receive this vaccine in this study?
So that is another piece that we're trying to estimate with the simulation is, again, using these different cutoffs. You can use cutoffs that are what we call very sensitive. So if we said, for example, anyone who shows up who has any Shigella, we're just going to call them a Shigella case. So then you're definitely getting all the true Shigella cases. You're also getting a lot of false positives. Or you can go in the other extreme and, put a very restrictive pathogen quantity cutoff, and you're being less sensitive, but probably more specific. So getting a lot of more like the true negatives. And so those things impact not only how biased our estimate of vaccine efficacy is, but also how many people we need to enroll in a trial in order to detect those differences. So it's all kind of a balancing game to try to get at kind of the best strategy.
Okay. And so, like you said, you're going to move on before these actual trials happen, but I'm sure you're going to stay in touch because I'm sure you're curious to know.
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been so great. Thank you so much for explaining your research.
Thank you.